Hello, I am back again for count 'em, two videos in one day. I'm on a roll. So, this is Gene as always, and I hope everybody is well. It's now about 5:30, which means it's pitch black outside. So the lighting in my room has gotten a bit more dim, gives this weird kind of orangey tint. But anyway, as with the previous video, I hope everyone's doing well. So, while politics are not really, let me try to get in the frame. Yeah, that's better. While politics are not really my forte, video games, in particular old school video games from the 1980s and 1990s, are certainly my alley. If there is one thing I know like the back of my hands, it is. This was for DX, not for Wonder Woman, just saying. But if there's one thing that I am most knowledgeable of, it is old school video games. And that's what this video is going to be about, at least in part. So I'm using this screen grab from Clownfish TV because they, A, are a wonderful channel. B, they were covering this doll, right, called Courtney 1986. Now I saw their video on it. I suggest you see that, you watch that for their take on it. They're much more knowledgeable of the 1980s, 80s culture than I am, being that I was born in the mid-80s, which means that by the time I was 5, it was 1990. So the 1990s are more my forte. They're a little bit older, so, they remember the 80s. I don't, for the most part. I'm knowledgeable of the 80s. I've seen, music videos, and I've, watched stuff and whatnot. I've looked into it and researched it, right? But there's nothing quite like having lived through it. You know what I mean? The closest thing I get to having lived through the 80s is being a child playing video games, being a gamer. I started gaming at 4 years old, so that would have been 1989, right? And my mother, like many mothers in across the world, in the U.S. and across the world, especially in Japan, your first video game system when you're that age is the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, right? And as I said in another video recently where I talked about my life in gaming more or less, you know, had the Super Mario 3-pack, which was Super Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt, and International Track and Field, right? So that's where my heart and soul is, right? I am very much a 90s kid. I am very much a child of my time. And my time started in the mid-80s, so what I started with were 80s video games. Like many people who are my age, mid-30s to probably mid-40s did. And of course, there are some who are older who probably remember things like the Atari 2600 and the Atari 7200 and whatnot. Right, but I'm going to start here with the mid-80s because, well, I'm 85, the doll's 86, I believe that the NES came out in 1984, I think it. So I'm about as old as modern gaming itself is, right? And since this particular topic I'm going to talk about starts specifically in 1986, I think it's a good place for me to pop in and sort of give my own viewpoint and my knowledge of old school video games. So, there's apparently this doll made by American Girl called Courtney 1986. I just sat through a 3-minute music video for it. It's very cute, in that way for little kids, right? I would say I'm not quite sure if it's authentically 80s. I do see a little more 1990s in there, in particular the way she's dressed with the acid jacket and jeans and all this other stuff. And apparently there's like a 25, 30-minute movie. I did not watch that. I don't like dolls enough to be sitting through a half-hour movie about them. I'm sorry. My mother got me a doll from my 4th birthday, I think it was, and I think it was a black Barbie doll too. I promptly tore the head off of it and asked her, "Where's the Rock'em Sock'em Robots?" Okay, I've been a tomboy all my life. Like one of my most treasured um, possessions as a child was the Sword of Romans from Thundercats. Thunder, Thundercats. Ah, that whole thing, right? And even when we were kids, I think it was 1992, the Christmas of 1992. I would have been about 7 years old. Right, we had all these toys, and we got Rock'em Sock'em Robots, and at that time, the Double Dragon cartoon was popular. So my mother, not that we knew at the time, kids, you still believe in Santa Claus and all that, right? But she got us, you know, Billy Lee and Jimmy Lee. Naturally, me being the hot-headed one, I got Jimmy Lee, which was fine by me. I was like, hey, it's a Ken. It's Ken. It's a Ken doll. And of course, when I say Ken doll, I mean Ken from Street Fighter, not Ken, Barbie's boyfriend. But anyway, that's the way I operate, right? But like any little girl, you know, especially if you were born in the 80s or you were born in the late 80s and you grew up in 1990s, right? You played with dolls. I did so under duress because I had a very girly cousin. We spent a lot of time at her place at the time, and I was made to play dolls, even though I wanted to play video games. Which, to be fair, I got to play plenty of video games at my aunt's house. Thanks, Aunt Michelle, wherever you are. And yeah, so I got to play a lot of NES games, especially Super NES games, because you know they were always sort of, they had more money, so they were always sort of like, you know, ahead, and they had what was considered cutting edge at the time, right? So I got to play or sit through playthroughs of games like, you know, Russian Attack and Castlevania and Super Mario 3 and a whole bunch of games, Legend of Zelda, all of that, right? So that's always going to be a huge part of my personal history as a gamer, where those, you know, those years spent at my aunt's house and my uncle, you know, he introduced us to like Golden Axe and Streets of Rage, so that stuff, right? It was a big family affair back when my family, my extended family, were still somewhat cordial. But that's a story for another day. But the reason I bring all this up is because of what this image says here. And I just want to address this and talk about female characters in video games, because this is something that constantly comes up, and the media constantly goes with this untrue narrative that women in video games, be they characters or be they players or be they you know, on the creative side or the programming side, right? They always act as if women were never part of it, or have always been kept out, which is not true. So this image says Courtney Moore, which is of course the name of the doll, Courtney 1986. You can see the top, it's kind of cut off, but it says 1986. So it says here, Courtney Moore is the highest scoring player in the arcade. Awesome, good for her. But she can't understand why there aren't more female characters in the game she plays. Cue me hitting my head on the keyboard. Stop! But anyway, when a school project gives Courtney a chance to create her own game, do they realize how difficult it was to make video games back in the 80s? It wasn't none. What school was giving this, and why wasn't I there? But anyway, she draws from real-life experiences to invent a female superhero who fights for a better future for everyone in the galaxy. Now, I want to be clear. I have no problem with the idea of, obviously, right? I have no problem with a girl being a gamer, or a girl being a talented gamer, right? It says here that she's the highest scoring player in the arcade. I have a problem with that. Awesome. I certainly have no problem with her being given an opportunity, as unrealistic as it would be. I have no problem with her being given an opportunity to create a video game. And if she wants to create a female superhero who fights for a better future, that's wonderful. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is this toxic, untrue narrative that why aren't there more female characters in the game she plays? Number one. Right? The video, and as Clownfish themselves point out, she's playing Pac-Man. You know what was more popular than Pac-Man? Miss Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man was more popular than Pac-Man. Okay? That's the one everybody remembers. Heck, there was eventually a point where there was a little Pac family. You had Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, and then the baby Pac pellet thing. Number one. Right, number two. Number two. 1986. Do you know what iconic video game came out on August 6, 1986? Metroid. You know, the game that created the trope, Samus is a girl. That came out in 1986. One of the most iconic characters in video games, one of the first female leads of a video game. Although, to be fair, most people didn't know it at the time because you had to beat the game under certain conditions to find out she was female. I will concede that, like caveat. But still, one of the most iconic games, not just in Nintendo's catalog, but just in gaming in general. One of the first original female leads in video games. Before Lara Croft, you had Samus Aran. And this was in 1986. So in the very year that this is set in, 1986, talking about why aren't there more female characters, and yet a video game featuring a woman as the lead, as the player character, was released the same flippin' year, that summer. Now, to answer the question of why there are not more female characters in video games at that time, like mid 80s, going into the 90s, here's the thing. Here's one of the major points that apparently no one ever considers, or at least if you're not a gamer, you don't consider this when this topic comes up. The hardware limitations, right? Systems like the NES, right? What was Sega's equivalent? Um, it wasn't the Master System, I don't. I think the Master System was the Genesis, right? I know Sega had a machine. I want to say the Sega Master System, but I don't think that was it. But I forget. But Sega had a machine, in 8-bit machine, which obviously they didn't become famous for, right? But then you had the Atari 7200, you had the 2600 and all that, right? But more or less, they were like 8-bit machines, right? And a lot of the video games back then were ports of games that were in the arcades, right? It's very limited hardware. A lot of stuff in those games are limited. The story is limited. The controls are limited. Player characters are limited. The colors are limited. The sound chip is limited. Because everything was limited. What frustrates me about this argument is that there's never, at least in my opinion, there is never acknowledgement of how gaming changed and improved over the years as the technology improved and more things were possible. I can tell you because I freaking had the game and I played it religiously. By the time 1989, 1990 hit, you had video games featuring women such as Golden Axe, right? You could play as 3 people in Golden Axe. You could play the barbarian guy. I think his name was Axe Battler, right? He was basically Conan. He was the one in the blue tights, right? You could play as the dwarf guy who was in green, right? I think his name was Thunderhead or something like that, but he had an axe. And then you could play as Tyrus Flare. Tyrus Flare, right? In a few years, you went from having video games like Super Mario Brothers, which only gave you 2 playable characters. Now, 4 years later, right? Three to four, let's say. Years later, you're up to 3 in a video game. In this case, a beat 'em up, but still up to 3, and one of them is a woman, right? So literally, 33% of your playable characters are female, and she's one of the most iconic women in video games. To the point where years later, I think in like the mid 2000s, she got her own video game. Now, granted, it wasn't the world's best video game, but still, there was no Axe Battler video game. There was no Axeman Thunderhead video game. Tyrus Flare got a video game. And then when you had Street Fighter 1987, that didn't feature any women. But then again, the game hardly worked. If you ever tried to pull a special move in the original Street Fighter game, which I have tried to do because I actually had the, what was it, the Capcom collection, where they put like all the original games. So yes, up until Street Fighter 4, I played every major title in Street Fighter's history, including the original one. And believe me when I tell you, that game is ridiculously difficult. 1 second. One second. Oh, man. Sorry about that. This is what happens when you try to record in real time. Anyways, I was saying, right, so in the same, I was talking about, oh yes, females in video games. I'm trying to remember my place now. Unfortunately, when you record in OBS, if you stop recording, it stops it. It doesn't pause it. I have some editing to do later. But anyway, right, what I was getting at, see, now I've lost my place. This sucks. But as I was saying, right, by 1989, you had one female character out of three, so you had 33% of your of your playable characters be female, and one of them is an iconic woman, right? Samus, not Samus, damn it, um, Tyrus Flair, Golden Axe, right? And then a few years later, right, you had Street Fighter. Ah, yes, talking about Street Fighter. Yes, the original Street Fighter game is clunky as hell. Don't play it. But then you had Street Fighter 2, right? Street Fighter 2, and then of course you had the first lady of fighting games, right? Chun-Li. You had Chun-Li, right? And then of course you had Mortal Kombat in 1992, which featured Sonya. Then by 1994 you would have had Mortal Kombat 2, which introduced Melina and Katana for the Mortal Kombat games, right? And of course for Street Fighter, you would have had Cammy, right? Because they added 4 new fighters in Super. They had T-Hawk, they had DJ, they had Fei Long, and they had Cammy, right? But my point is this, right? As gaming went on and the technology improved, the amount of characters you could play as, especially in games like fighting games where you need to have multiple choices, right? But those games, as they got better, right, as technology improved, it allowed for more things, more functions, more controls, better graphics, better colors, better sound, and more playable characters. And as you got more playable characters, in addition, you got more female playable characters, right? And now I know the ones that I have listed have often been in fighting games because that's my forte. In the 1990s was the age of the fighting game, right? But even in that, right, you had games. What was it? 1996, right? Tomb Raider first comes out, I think 95, 96. And again, an iconic video game, which led to an iconic video game series where your protagonist is a woman, right? And this game is still, in this game series, and the character of Lara are still considered iconic and controversial to this day. I want to repeat, women were never kept out of video games. Female characters were never kept out of video games. As video games improved, they have been featured more and more and more and more and more. And this is me just talking about very small subset, which is just the games that I grew up playing and I grew up knowledgeable of. This isn't talking about, say, like, Japanese RPGs, which always featured multiple characters and always featured female characters, right? Plenty, right? Going back to the early Final Fantasy titles, and you had Phantasy Star, right? There was what? I think there was a game, The Legend of Dragoon. That's my brother's like favorite RPG, JRPG of all time. I think it is. That one had a prominent female, two at least, probably several more, because it's been a long time. But you could play as Shauna. She was like the good girl of the game. She was love interest. You could play as this dark magic woman named Rose. There was Meru. She had some sort of bat, like a mallet, Harley Quinn type mallet thing. Like many different types of playable female characters in many different types of games and genres, and you even go further now into the future, right? You had like Final Fantasy X, you had 10-2, you had Final Fantasy 13, where again, and that spawned a series of games, right? And then you had, Lightning as the lead character and all this stuff. So I would like to put, I know that they're probably not going to hear me, but I would like for this narrative that girls were kept out of video games, female characters weren't in video games, to rest. It's a lie. It's not true. They are holding 1986 standards, right? Or rather, what I should say is that they are using the standards of today, right? Which are not agreed upon, which are by no means reasonable or fair, right? But they're using They are using 2020 standards and using it to judge 1986 while completely disregarding the fact that an iconic video game featuring a woman was released in the summer of that same year. You want to make fun of the 80s or the 1990s, you want to laugh at it, you want to point out how goofy it was. Okay, fine, I got no problem with that. I was there, I'll laugh along with you. Okay, I remember Lisa Frank and all that. You could not pay me to touch Lisa Frank. I was too much of a tomboy, way too butch. I don't mess with unicorns now. I didn't then, right? I don't care if you want to make fun of it, right? Everything has a humorous element to it, but be honest about it, right? In its own way, it kind of reminds me of when Anita Sarkeesian did a video. I forget which video it was. Might have been the women as background decoration one or whatever. But she has this like quick snippet of like female characters, and the whole idea is that she is trying to say these women are just seen as sex objects in their respective games, and one of them is the boss from Metal Gear Solid 3. Right, and it's the part where at the end of the game when her cat suit's unzipped and you can see down her navel and all that stuff, and you see the snake-shaped scar on her chest, and that made me livid. That to this day is the reason why I cannot stand Anita Sarkeesian. To this day, this is why I can't stand this woman. It's because of that. That is what convinced me she was a liar. Because I played that game. I owned that game. That game was my life. I have played through that scene numerous times. I played through the whole game numerous times. I knew exactly what the boss was about. And the boss was not about sex appeal or fan service. Now, if you found her attractive, that's up to you. But that was the point of her character. That was Eva. And even she was more than just sex appeal and fan service. But that was Eva's role. That wasn't the boss's role. The boss, when she opens up her catsuit, it's a moment of fan disservice. It's actually quite painful and sorrowful because she's talking about everything that she gave up and she lost. And to feature that and basically try to say, oh, the boss is a bimbo, by taking one snippet at the end of the game and not putting it in context, that convinced me she was a liar. And while I don't think that this Courtney 1986 thing intends to be quite like that, I must say that it does, again, it tells a false story. It doesn't explain why there weren't a lot of female characters in video games. It just says, oh, she doesn't understand why. Anyone ever tried to explain it to her that it's a hardware issue? Anybody tell her that? Did anyone tell Courtney this? Did a woman who works in video games or a woman who's played video games understands the hardware side of it tell her, hey, you can only program like 2 main characters at this point? And besides, didn't like Super Mario 2 have like Princess Peach as a playable character? I think it did. It's not a well-remembered game, but I do think it had Princess Peach as a playable character, if my memory serves me. Cobwebs up in here with my ever graying hair. But anyway, all I ask for is that when it comes to video games, especially old school video games that I grew up with, be honest about them. You don't have to like them. You don't have to understand them. That's fine with me. There are plenty of things I don't like and I don't understand. But be honest. Be honest about them. That is all I ask of you. Be honest about it. Right? Be honest about it. And instead of trying to make everything a problem, any supposed lack in video games is a problem. There's not enough women. There's not enough gay people. There's not enough this. There's not enough that. Why can't we celebrate the advancements that have been made? How it's become more inclusive, both in character design and people working in the business and players and all that. Why can't we celebrate the positives instead of casting false negatives on the past of all things, especially since the past cannot be changed? You can learn from the past. You can revisit the past, especially on YouTube, right? Nothing's ever truly gone, but you can't change it. You can't change the fact that the first Street Fighter game didn't have a female character, and you can't change the fact that on August 6, 1986, Metroid was released, and that had a playable female character. Not just a playable female character, but the lead of the game. All I ask for is just a little honesty. That's all I'm asking. Be honest. Be honest. That's all I ask of you. Especially if you're going to market something like video games, which are still a very niche thing, and still get um, viciously mischaracterized and maligned, and you're going to try to explain it and sell it to an audience where the majority of them are not going to be people who play video games or who are familiar with them and who are that invested in, I guess you could say, about that life as someone like me is. Like, the only reason I know as much as I do is because I literally grew up with this. Literally grew up with it. If I didn't have that ingrown knowledge of having watched it literally change over the years, if I was one of these young girls, or the mother of one of these young girls picking up this toy, I would totally believe what they say, because you believe that they did the research, they would know, right? Yeah, why weren't there a lot of female characters in video games in the mid '80s? That's kind of weird. Except it's not. It's not. And it's not the problem that they make it out to be then or now. But the only way you're going to have that information is if you happen to have been a gamer who grew up gaming. You happen to be someone who grew up doing it. Many people did, like myself, but many people didn't. So for the sake of those who didn't, I hope you come across this video and realize that what the media tells you about video games, 95% of it is wrong. Not only is 95% of it wrong, 95% of it is a lie. Now, I'm going to finish this off with a quote from a video game character, although I must say this was from a cartoon, right? There was this old cartoon, it was a Street Fighter cartoon series on the USA Network. This came out around, 1994, around the time the god-awful live-action Street Fighter cartoon came out, right? And there was this scene where, like, Cammy realizes she's been brainwashed and everything she knows is a lie, right? So she shouts, "Everything is lies! Everything is lies!" And that, sadly, is how a lot of things go when it comes to how video games are portrayed in media. Most of it's a lie. If you want to know, ask an actual female gamer. I'm right here. If you have any questions, let a sister know. Anyway, probably chill and maybe watch some Wreck-It Ralph. It's probably the only thing that I've seen in recent years that was actually felt like a true homage and a love letter to the video games that I grew up with. So I forget what company was behind that, but whatever company it was, thank you. You did my heart good. You actually honored something instead of just denigrating it and tearing it down. But anyway, that's the video. Please let me know what you think, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day or night. Bye.